Yay Networks.
I'm Molly Kimball. Welcome to Fueled, a wellness and nutrition podcast. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition journalist with a passion to help people live their strongest, healthiest life possible. In my weekly TV segments and columns, there's a limited amount of time and space to cover everything, but there's so much more to share. This podcast is my opportunity to dive deeper into the topics you want to know about. This week's episode is about DNA diets, those DNA testing kits that claim to pinpoint very precise details for us, like exactly what type of diet is best for us, the specifics on calories, carbs, protein, fat, also things like what nutritional supplements we need, or even what types of workouts are best suited for us based on our specific DNA profile. So is the science really there? Are we really able to learn and measure and be guided by our genes when it comes to these things that are also so heavily influenced by our environment and our behaviors? So this is part one of a two-part series, and I will be joined in both by Dr. Chris D'Adamo. Dr. D'Adamo is a medical research scientist with expertise in nutritional genetics and personalized nutrition. So in this episode, he's going to just walk us through understanding the testing, understanding the science of how this testing is even available to us. In next week's episode, he's going to walk through my specific test results with me. So I'll be doing tests for 23andMe and also a company called VitaGene. And each of these, we've done 3 tests. Myself, my husband, Brad, has done another, and then a client of mine who has a completely different makeup, completely different body type, background. And all 3 of us have very different nutritional needs and profiles, differing food sensitivities, etc. So he'll be actually walking through my results with me, and we'll kind of be comparing and contrasting some of these other results as well. So today, Dr. D'Adamo and I will be talking, really an overarching conversation about genetics and personalized nutrition and the influence of our genes on our weight and our health. There's the genetic influence, which is out of our control, but there's a lot that's largely in our control, such as our choice of diet, movement, sleep. So we'll be talking today about what are some of the factors related especially to weight and health that truly are influenced by our genes. Some of these genes, for example, they can produce higher levels of hunger hormones. They can give us a genetic predisposition to store body fat versus using that body fat efficiently as a fuel source. So we'll be talking today about just how much of an impact does our genetic makeup influence our weight, and also what other factors do impact our weight and our overall health. We'll also be covering, are these DNA testing kits useful, truly useful, and if so, how? And if we're choosing to spend the time and the money to do these kits, what do we need to keep in mind? What do we need to know to truly reap maximum and reliable benefits? So first, a bit about our guest, Dr. Chris D'Adamo. He's a medical research scientist with expertise in the synergistic effects of healthy lifestyle, environment, and genetics, and how these all play a role on our health and our wellness. Dr. D'Adamo received his PhD in epidemiology from the University School of Medicine, and he serves as the director for the Center for Integrative Medicine at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. Dr. D'Adamo leads an extensive education program, including an elective course for fourth-year medical students, which is really cool, a culinary medicine educational series that combines evidence-based nutrition education and hands-on cooking that's also part of the required medical student curriculum. So I love that. I love bringing that nutrition expertise, that culinary expertise into the medical school. Dr. D'Adamo has published his findings in numerous peer-reviewed scientific and medical journals, and he's been featured in USA Today, Men's Health, WebMD, Natural Health, Shape Magazine, Dr. Oz, Food Network, and many more. I'm truly grateful to him for joining us today and sharing his expertise. So with that, welcome, Dr. D'Adamo. I'm excited to have you here with us today.
Thanks, Molly. It's a pleasure to be here and look forward to the conversation.
So when our listeners just heard your bio, and I have to say that's only a snippet of it. It's much more lengthy, but let's talk a little bit about what you do and kind of what your career looks like, what you've done, what you're involved in, because I think that's really fascinating. And I think it also helps our listeners understand why you are who's going to be talking us through all this DNA and personalized nutrition.
Sure. Well, I stay pretty busy. I will frame it in that way. But I'm a nutritional epidemiologist by training, actually. So I did my PhD looking at micronutrients and physical function and inflammation with aging. But as time has gone along, I've led a bunch of clinical trials of, whole diets, dietary supplements. We've done nutritional interventions in schools, in underserved communities. And then we've also done a lot of the basic science of this too. So we'll be talking today about nutritional genetics. So we've done some work looking at genetic associations with certain carotenoids that we find in fruits and vegetables. So, I'm really interested in the application of all of this. And that's why I like looking, from the very detailed level of what's happening mechanistically when we look at the impact that food has on our health and physiology, all the way up to what does it look like when we intervene with human beings or in systems and so on. So it's been a lot of fun. It's hard work, but I love getting a chance to kind of break it all down in venues like this.
And before we get into what we're talking about with genetics and personalized nutrition, let's talk a little bit about the work that you're doing with culinary medicine, only because I got to give a plug. I'm excited that the processes that were kind of developed here in New Orleans at the Gold Ring Center for Culinary Medicine, you guys incorporate this.
Yeah, that's one of the big things. So, again, I'm really passionate about education. So at the Center for Integrative Medicine, we've been around since 1991. So we're approaching our 30th anniversary. I wasn't there back then, but I have been around for like the last 10 years. And we've really increased the amount of nutrition lifestyle education that we're offering medical students. So for anyone who's been frustrated, maybe that they feel like, God, I went to my physician and we didn't hear much at all about what I can do with diet or movement or sleep or any of this kind of stuff. I think that's changing. And one of the things that I've been happiest with has been, the great work that was done and is being done at the Tulane Gold Ring Center. We were inspired by that, and now we're offering it to all of our medical students. So just this morning, my team is preparing for a ketogenic diet lecture. So we've done sort of an overall framework. We've taught about Mediterranean diets. So we talk about the principles, some of the misconceptions, the research, and then we cook in that. We've done plant-based diets, we've done paleo diets, and next up is keto diets. And the key there, as I'm sure you realize, is that there's a lot of, commonalities. There's so much sort of like bickering and fighting over which diet's best, or, and it can be pretty intense online. And we're actually saying, what are some of the commonalities? And it's, really whole food eating and so on. But we're really excited to be getting first and second year medical students basically fresh out of the gate. Their medical training is very practical with these dietary lectures and experiential training that I hope, 10 years from now when we go to the doctor and they, I got high blood pressure. Well, let's look at what you're eating, as opposed to maybe going right to the prescription pad.
It's huge. And exposing the physicians to this, because what can also be potential positives, because a lot of times, mainstream health professionals, we hear keto and people bristle, but there's actually aspects of it that do truly have benefit. There's some ways that people can do modified and heavier plant-based keto and modified keto that, there can be some. So I'm happy to hear that, there's this high exposure to these things because there's just not a lot of that in medical school for the nutrition education component.
Very little. Right now, like the requirements are 25 hours across the course of your training, and that's 3 days. If you think about it, for something that's so fundamental to human health, which is nutrition. But that is starting to change. And to your point, it's been a lot of fun, I think, breaking down some of the misconceptions. So when we did the plant-based diet session, the recipes that we prepared were also paleo. So despite all this, all fighting that people do on plant-based or paleo or keto, when this is done through a whole food lens, all of these ways can be done well. And of course, there's risks and things we need to keep in mind with these different diets, that we want to do clean keto, or when someone's doing a vegan diet with certain supplements, or a paleo diet, making sure that it's not like packaged paleo, that it's, real paleo. So there are things there, but it has been fun to sort of serve as the bridge between these different dietary approaches.
So talking about, what we're looking at today of these DNA diet kits, let's talk a little bit about the overarching view of genetics and personalized nutrition. And I think, there's a lot of, it's one of these things that we know about, we know it exists, but it's so foreign to so many of us. So let's talk about the influence of our genes on our weight and health. And I think it's really important, and I'd like to kind of hear your insight on how much is influenced by our genes, which is completely out of our control. We really cannot control what our genetic makeup is, versus what is in our control, like our choice of diet and movement and sleep. And so I think I'd like to kind of dive into that. And then what are some of the factors related to our weight and our health that are influenced by genes? And I know there's a whole lot here before we even get into the nitty gritty on a lot of the DNA kits and nutrition that's marketed to us.
So yeah, you're right. We can't do about our genes until we become CRISPR technology designer humans, right? The way some people seem to want to go with that, but seriously, no. And this is an area where clearly, I like the direction this is going, but we're not there yet. But we are there in some ways, and I'll get down to the cryptic language. I mean, I think we. Clearly, nutrition is not one size fits all. We know that. We know that one person can eat a peanut and be fine, and another can go on anaphylactic. I mean, just shock. I mean, there's huge differences. There's with variants in lactose tolerance and so on. I mean, and then you get kind of at the bigger picture level. I tried low carb and it worked really well for me, and for someone else it may not have. So there's a lot of these things. There's clearly not a one size fits all. So I think we're heading in the right direction. I think with some of these kits might be a little bit premature when we get really prescriptive about it. But what we do know is that our genes influence the absorption of a wide variety of micronutrients. And that's when my team and I have done some of the original research there. So that's very clear. Things like folate, vitamin B12, vitamin D, iron, the carotenoids. We've done a lot of work with the carotenoids in particular. So that's clear. It's also clear that our genes can have some impact on weight, although it's not huge. So, and I'll pause after this. There's like the FTO gene, for example, FTO for fat mass and obesity gene, and variants on that have been shown to impact people's weight, but it's not by a whole lot. We're talking 2, 3, 4, 5 pounds, something in that range.
So if you find out that you have the FTO gene, like all hope is not lost.
Well, most definitely not. So with these things, we all have the genes. There's about 30,000 or so genes. And when we talk about these different things, we're actually talking about variants on the genes. So there are SNPs, SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. So let's say you have something like FTO or MTHFR, which some of your listeners may be familiar with. There are these SNPs on these genes, and a lot of times there's actually a lot of SNPs on them. So if we look at FTO, someone might say, gosh, I have the SNP. Therefore, I'm sort of destined to be overweight. It's just not the case, because it's a pretty modest effect. And these SNPs are, if any of your listeners have ever gotten a 23andMe test or any of these others, it's RS and then a long string of numbers. That's the SNP. And different SNPs have different effects. I mean, they can have a big effect, as in the case with some of the C677T variant on MTHFR, which has a big impact on our folate concentrations, or they can have sort of more modest effects like FTO does have on weight.
Okay, so there's the fact of there are genetic variations that can have an influence on a variety of functions in our body and the way that things are manifested in our body, but that can be in a very, very small way, or it can be in a very, very significant way. And so then we can't just immediately make the assumption that because we have this genetic variance and we're seeing this is a really big issue. So we always have to know what level of perspective we need to have for these. Or some of the things like we all know the people who like they're insatiable. They seem to always be hungry no matter what they do. Or the person who we see them exercising all the time and they never seem to either slim down or get stronger or whatever their goals are. They just don't seem to respond physically to exercise. Are some of these, how would we know, are some of these potentially related to their genetic makeup, or is it lifestyle choices that are kind of hidden that might not be so obvious to us?
Well, I think genes are going to play a role. And I in my bio, I don't think I mentioned I was a personal trainer for a long time and a lifelong athlete. And when I work with clients, I saw this too. You would. I know exactly the type of situation you're talking about where someone is on the treadmill every day. You see them at the gym over and over again and sadly weren't able to lose weight. I think part of that is probably because weight and body composition is more strongly influenced by nutrition, I think is part of it. But, without knowing what that type of individual is doing with their diet, it's hard to say. But let's say that they are, eating well for who they are. And they are moving and they're sleeping and they're managing their stress because there's so many different factors that go into weight. There are some genetic variants. There's also some variants in the microbiota, which is it's a close cousin to this topic because the microbiota, their microbiome, we hear that more. They have far more genes than we do, collectively. So, and there's some influence of that on weight too. But again, these don't seem to be huge influences on it. They play a role, but it's not the main thing. Much more it's lifestyle. And look, I had clients, I know for some people, it's just not that easy. And I think of a few clients in particular I had where I knew they were doing the right things. So there are some of these factors that we just don't fully understand. And genes is one of them.
And there's also those that seem to do very little and then their bodies quickly respond to it. And everyone else is like, oh gosh, now here they are with their like ripped abs and everything. And they're hardly doing it, So it is interesting that some are just more predisposed to having that, the high reaction or high, reward for what might not be as hard of an effort put into it. I'd like to take a minute to talk about our sponsor of this week's episode, Sweaty Betty. So we learned a lot in 2020, including that comfort is the new everything. From our workouts to our errands to our actual work, London's own Sweaty Betty has us covered in style. So meet Sweaty Betty's Gary pants. These are your new favorite everyday pants that keep you cool, casual, and totally on trend. I love that they're made from this really super soft, lightweight fabric. I also love that they have this relaxed fit with a waistband that's like it's in just the right spot. And these fitted cuffs that stay put just where you want them to be. They have a perfect shape. They're a really cozy fit without any of the bulk. It's also no wonder that these pants are the Sweaty Betty staff's pick for everyday comfort. And because we all deserve to look amazing before, during, and after our workouts, go to sweatybetty.com/fueled and use our code FUELED at checkout to get 20% off your purchase. This is the best offer Sweaty Betty has available anywhere. That's spelled SWEATYBETTY.com/fueled and use our code FUELED at checkout. That's sweatybetty.com/fueled, promo code FUELED. Do we have any idea, and we may not, when we do look at talking about how much of our health, our weight is influenced by our genetic makeup versus lifestyle choices? Do we think it's 50-50? Is it much more lifestyle choices? Is it much more heavy in that way? What's your thoughts on that?
This is a really difficult thing to quantify because it's going to vary so much. It's hard to even say because when we talk about lifestyle, if we think about how we would design a study around that, how would we even really measure that? It's tough to say. Would we do an intervention with all these different lifestyle factors and then compare people and then take them off and say, go back to eating poorly and not sleeping, not moving. So it's tough to say. I personally think, and I'm not discounting the fact that it is more difficult. It's not fair. I mean, I know, and with our patients that we've treated at our clinical practice and with the clients I used to see, it's not fair. A lot of times there are other factors, but I think it's far and away more on the side of lifestyle. Sort of the epigenetics, which we can talk a little bit today too. than it is with genes, certainly for weight, but I think for health as well. I mean, I think a lot of these things, those that might be predisposed towards inflammation or have a family history of cancer and some of these types of things, there's also often closely linked with that a family history of exposures or a family coupling of exposures. And that's tough to take out sometimes. A lot of times there tend to be similar habits, there tend to be similar exposures to environmental toxins and so on. So there's a lot there, and it's not to discount genes. It's been a good deal of my career working on that. That plays an impact. But I really think, and this is what I believe is encouraging for people, is that the epigenetics or stuff, what we do affects the expression of our genes is far more powerful.
So the bottom line on that being that, yes, genes have an influence on our weight. Genes do impact all aspects of our health, but our genes are not the end. Our genes are not our destiny. Things are not completely out of our control.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's a saying I like to, that genes are a predisposition, not a predetermination. So they will have an impact. But I think, interestingly, this is why the FDA did not allow 23andMe to actually have some health. They ran into some trouble because people were freaking out and saying, well, I'm just going to throw in my cards because I have whatever this genetic variant is. I'm doomed. And the fact of the matter is it's not true. I mean, there are some monogenic traits that are out there where a single gene, but those are very rare. The vast majority of them are, lots of different genes that work together. It's why with the genetic tests, I think the better ones that are out there that actually advise on lifestyle factors, diet and otherwise, are those that look at clusters of genetic variants. Because, and I see this, an example that might resonate with some of your listeners is that, again, with MTHFR, we'll take this one because it's so common. The C677T variant, for those that are homozygous, in other words, they have both copies of the sort of bad variant, they are going to have a hard time methylating their folate. So basically producing usable folate. That's pretty big. It's about 65% or so. But for a lot of these other ones, it's pretty minor. But so what a lot of people do is say, well, I have this variant. I'm going to take lots of high levels of methylfolate. And that would seem to make sense. But the thing is, there's all these other compensations. There's all these other genes that can help sort of compensate for whatever that one variant is. So what do I need to look at this? It's the ultimate systems, biology type of thing. So you can have that. And then people start taking a lot of folate and then like, God, I actually feel kind of crappy. That's because they had these other variants that were sort of compensating for that or accommodating that variant they had. And then they end up having too much, so it's a tricky thing. So the test, I'm going to be curious to see the tests that you get and see what they come up with, because the better ones will look at a bunch of these different genes and the variants on them together.
Okay, so looking at clusters versus that one isolated. So you're basically looking at it in the context of the clusters versus that one single piece.
Yeah, and I'd even go so much, even a few steps further than that. So you'd also want to look at where's it look at with the labs. So does the patient or individual have inflammation or whatever else it might be, high homocysteine, if we're talking about this whole methylation type of thing. And do they have any symptoms? So, I mean, I think there's sometimes, I consider myself like a biohacker and self-quantifier. I have a passion for healthy lifestyle. So I love measuring all these things in myself too. But if I see something and I don't have any symptoms of it, I'm not going to necessarily intervene on it. So I think we need to look at the genes, some of the labs and other sort of markers that might be suggestive of a problem, and then the actual symptoms themselves.
Have you done any of these test kits yourself?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm really interested in this. So I've done it where I've got my 23andMe, and there's a bunch of filters where you can run your information. Some are actually free, others are low cost, others are more. And you can look and see what you've got. And I thought it was somewhat revealing for me. I mean, one thing that I came across was I do horribly around environmental toxins, things like mold or cigarette smoke, pesticides. If I go out and walk around and they've sprayed the lawns, I can feel it. It like permeates my whole being because I don't detoxify very well. So that's where, I looked and lo and behold, I had some genes that, variants that suggested I don't detoxify very well. So I was, I started, so forafane is one of these, I don't know if we'll talk about it today or another time, these nutrigenomic side where actually the food impacts the expression of genes. So I started taking this product called Abmacol, which could help upregulate my detoxification genes, and did a whole bunch of other things. Or drink more water, just be more careful with things, and so on. So there's stuff like that we can do. I think that we get out of this, but you got to kind of know yourself pretty well. When appropriate, to work with a healthcare professional who knows about this stuff. Not that many of them do, unfortunately, but so that's sort of what I did in my personal story with it.
So that's when you were just saying that when you get a report back, not to just act on what your genetic report says, but to also look at, okay, what are these labs? What are these symptoms? Well, on something like that, there's not a lab for you to look at, but you knew you had these symptoms. So you had this report in your genetic profile, you had this result, and then you also knew that you were experiencing those symptoms when exposed to that. So those two things combined, then you said, okay, now I need to act on it and see what I can do to help upregulate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you want to do stuff, I think, that's supported by clinical trials too, because there's a lot of people that are out there looking to sell things based on this, so I ate a really clean diet to begin with. And I think the main thing for me is just to try not to be around it, but I did that, and I went into literature and saw, this might be able to help me detoxify better. And
did you notice any improvement after you did?
I did. Yeah. So, I also travel a decent amount. So another time where I would giving a conference presentation talks and so on. When I used to fly, the air quality is really bad there. You're getting that recirculated jet fuel, unfortunately, that I would be pretty run down. And after I took the Abmacol and a few other steps, that I started to, would feel better, have a little more energy afterwards. And, chlorella is something else that can help too. So there are things out there that can help a sluggish detoxification system. But detox is one of the areas where I think there's a lot of, I'm sure you've seen this in your practice and work, where, there's all these like fiber supplements and like detox potions and so on, where I think, I like to go the stuff that has the clinical trial data. But no, it helped. And I still don't like being around cigarette smoke very much or mold, but these things have helped me, deal with it a little bit better.
And that's a great example, because these reports have so much data in them that if we acted on every single thing that might pop up in our own personal reports, it would feel really overwhelming. So then filtering through these and seeing, okay, well, what am I seeing that also kind of matches either what I'm feeling or what I've had blood work that reflects this, and then really being a little bit more selective then and more strategic in what do we act on to try to improve.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Otherwise, it's overwhelming. I mean, and I think if when you do yours, or when any of your listeners have, you can look at a list. One of the ones that I've run my 23andMe data through is called Promethease. And you can have like 10 different genes that say you're like half say you're at high risk of colon cancer, and then half you're at lower risk of colon cancer, whatever it might be. So a lot of this stuff just kind of like, if you looked at any one of those and tried to act on all the ones that you say you have a risk, you'd be driving yourself crazy, because a lot of times there's other ones that compensate for that. So it's the way I look at it, I think.
And so talk to us about, where do you want to go from here? Do you want to talk with us about kind of as you referred to it, the two sides of the coin with personal nutrition, or do you want to go personalized nutrition, or do you want to go into epigenetics?
Well, I'll talk about the two sides of the coin, because that will lead in. One of the sides is an epigenetic phenomenon. So with personalized nutrition and nutritional genetics, personalized nutrition actually is even broader than one coin. It's two sides. There's many coins. There's things like preference, access, all kinds of things that go into a true personalization, activity levels and so on, what people are doing. But we're talking about nutritional genetics, because genetics are just one part of the personalization. The microbiome, certainly a part of that too. But if we look at the genetics side, nutritional genetics, I'd say I've seen it written, and I like to look at this way too, that there's two sides to it. There's nutrigenetics and nutrigenomics. Okay, one side of the coin is nutrigenetics, and that is the impact that our genes have on our response to food. So an example of this, and we did some work on this and published it, I can share if you like, is I can eat a tomato and you can eat a tomato. And all things being equal, let's say we ate it with the same amount of olive oil, right? So we know it's fat soluble. I could have a different lycopene response than you, and that is because our genes are different and influence how much lycopene, which is involved in protection from prostate cancer and can help lower lipids and so on. It's a very important nutrient. How much we have in our bodies. So that's the impact that genes have on our response to food. Conversely, you have the impact that our food has in the expression of our genes. So we haven't talked too much about this other than the sulforaphane side. This is an epigenetic phenomenon where basically, the foods and nutrients you take in are turning on and off the expression of a whole bunch of genes. So that's what I mean by that. Everything that I talked about, like with MTHFR or vitamin D or vitamin B12, all the variants or FTO, these are all how the impact that our genes have on our response to food. But I can talk a little bit about this other side, which I think in a lot of ways even more exciting, because that's something we can all do. We can't really change our genes. We can be aware of them and maybe eat accordingly. But it's really fascinating to think about every bite we take is turning off and on a whole bunch of genes through this other side of the coin, the nutrigenomic side, the epigenetic side.
And what are some of those, and how? So what foods do affect them, and is it positive, is it negative, or both?
Well, some are going to be negative and some are going to be positive. I mean, there's two main mechanisms of this. There's a number of other ones too, but there's a methylation. And there's histone deacetylases that we think about. And I'll break it down pretty simply. So methylation basically turns genes off, for lack of that's a pretty simplistic way of looking at it. But when you methylate something, you turn a gene off, and histone deacetylases sort of turn the expression on. Now, we generally speaking we don't want extreme amounts of either of these things. With nutrition, a lot of times there's a middle path that's best. You don't want too much of a vitamin, can be toxic. Too little can be deadly. So, but what we want to get with these two is a lot of times most people are better served inhibiting this histone deacetylases, are called HDAC, and most people want to actually methylate more. So there's a whole variety of foods. I can list some of them that are in both categories. So, and if there is a family history of cancer, here's where, again, I think the genes are important, but the lifestyle is more important. So HDAC is very important. So we'll look at that. So things like I mentioned sulforaphane, other for EGCG in green tea, quercetin. If you've heard about that when it comes to COVID. Resveratrol. So what foods are these in? So these are typically in, EGCGs in green tea, curcumin. We hear a lot about that in the orange spice turmeric. Quercetin, which is often a supplement, but it's in apple skins and onion skins and these types of things. And sulforaphane, which is in broccoli sprouts. You don't get much in the broccoli plant, but you get it in the sprouts. So that's the HDAC side of things. And I can send you a paper that gets into some of the details of that. I can talk about methylation too, if you like.
That'd be great, because we can link to those in the episode notes here. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So methylation, your B vitamins are really big. So I mentioned, on the other side of the coin, how there's some variants, the one called FUT2, that if you have those variants, you may need to get more B12, but B12 is a really powerful methylator. SAMe, S-adenosine methionine. That's a supplement usually. That's a very powerful methylator. But things like vitamin C, which is in a lot of our fruits and vegetables, selenium in Brazil nuts and so on, zinc, which is, again, very important for the immune system. It's in shellfish and meats and so on, magnesium, choline. So here's where the egg yolks, this is one of those ones where it can be confusing. 1 week we hear eggs are bad for us, the next they are good. A lot of that depends on what the chicken was eating. Is it pasture raised, or is it sort of one of these factory farmed ones? Omega-3 fats, and then this is very important for people who maybe suspect they're poor methylators, and there's tests of that actually. The dimethylglycine and trimethylglycine or betaine, which is in beets actually. So there's a lot of foods that can help out with this. These tend to be in pretty healthy foods for the most part. So I think, again, when you're eating a colorful, nutrient-dense diet, you're going to get a lot of these mechanisms that are going on that frankly, many of us never even heard of.
So talk with us about like the methylation when we're talking about the quercetin, the green tea extract, the, curcumin. What does that mean when we talk about these things are methylators? Explain that to us, like, and to the layperson, what does that mean?
Sure. So it means they're methyl donors, and a lot of people don't methylate very well. So it's just this process that has an impact on genetic expression. And with age and with disease, usually there is what's called hypomethylation, or just not methylating enough. So you get these methyl donors, and things like, conditions like depression. Again, it's involved in detoxification. That was one of the issues I was having, which is why I take a TMG supplement for my methylation support. And I eat lots of sardines and stuff like that to get B12 and egg yolks and choline. So they basically help contribute to this state of overall methylation that tends to be low. And there's actually, methylation is one of the marks. You may have heard about this DNA test. That's another thing that doesn't look at your genes and the variants in your genes, but it looks at your basically your epigenetic phenomenon like this. And it's there's something called the Horvath clock, which looks at basically looks at your genes. And I've heard explained by David Sinclair, who's done a lot of the work with this, who's really big into NAD plus and precursors and aging and so on, that it's sort of like your DVD. Back when we used to use those, more like the scratches that it has on it. So there's tests of methylation that can show basically how many scratches does the DVD of your DNA have on it. So by having these kinds of nutrients, it can essentially help your body methylate properly.
So these genetic tests and the test kits that we're talking about, many of them will show if someone is, as you say, not a good methylator. And then we would know, okay, well, there's, a variety of things, whether it's B12 or, as you said, choline with egg yolks, or zinc, selenium. Mm-hmm. And this methylation, being a good methylator, means that the methylation is like changing the activity of the DNA segment that influences how our genes are expressed. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's one of the mechanisms that does that. Yes. And it's a tough thing to look at, because there's you can look at the total methylation that's going on in a person, but there's also methylation on specific genes. But we do know, when we look at it en masse, that those that are hypomethylators tends to travel with states of poor health. So by getting these nutrients, and what the genetic tests will tell you is, the genetic tests, like those that look at your actual DNA, at your genes and the variants, will tell you if you're susceptible to being a poor methylator, but they won't tell you necessarily that you have bad levels of methylation. This is where the labs that would come in.
Okay.
So that's where things looking like at methionine, or I'm sorry, homocysteine. You can look at methionine too. That some of these labs that can actually show, okay, you have all of these variants that suggest poor methylation, and you have symptoms. Well, that's probably a sign that you may want to intervene, at least making sure that someone's getting enough B12 and folate and possibly SAMe and choline and some of these types of things. But you can go a step further and actually look at levels in the blood that are reflective. Now that's a little tougher to get access to those types of tests. It's a little more complicated, but there are there. And then separately, there are these tests like DNAge that will look broadly at the methylation status across a wide variety of genes. And they've been able to link that, which is pretty interesting, pretty conclusively with the age of all kinds of different species. So from like worms to fish to others. So they've actually done some interesting testing on that. So that's kind of how it all fits together. It's multiple pieces to the puzzle.
But it seems like if you're looking at kind of just the broad overall methylation, it doesn't give someone the clarity or the granularity of where there might be issues that they could target specifically.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of a broad kind of 30,000 foot view look at it.
And then all those foods that you talked about too that help our bodies become better methylators, the B vitamins, selenium, zinc, egg yolks with the choline, These are all foods that, as dietitians, we're always encouraging people to incorporate these because of the nutritional benefits. And this is likely one reason why. We know that there are nutritional benefits associated with these, and there's a lot of different mechanisms of how, and likely one of them is because of this influence on genetic expression, it's sounding like.
Absolutely. Yep. I mean, that's what's kind of cool about it. We kind of figured out, that eating these whole food types of diets are associated with better health. And we're understanding more and more why. And what this does is that it gives us more and more precision on how to intervene specifically with maybe people who have autoimmunity or depression or something like that. But yeah, that's sort of the big picture view. Things like this, genetic expression, it's related to inflammation, it's related to oxidative stress. So all these mechanisms that underlie the healthy diet that we recommend, healthy types of diets that we recommend.
So when the DNA testing kits are claiming to pinpoint really precise details, because this is very broad, and this is on micronutrients, and this kind of falls under that umbrella with micronutrients and with certain things like this and how we absorb, that you felt like there's a little bit more clarity. But when it comes to some of the other details that the testing kits are giving us, or saying that they're diagnosing for us, like exactly what type of diet is best for us, or giving us a breakdown of, based on your genetic profile, you need this many calories, this much protein, carb, and fat, and giving us these very prescriptive diets, you're saying the science just isn't there.
I think it's a little speculative. I mean, there have been some studies that looked at sort of like the whole shebang, where they would run some of these genetic panels and then look and see, how did people do when they had that testing versus not. But it's still kind of in the early innings of that. I think it's a little bit, I think you could say, all right, we have these variants. You might want to be especially aware to get iron, or we look at macronutrients. You may do better potentially with low carb or low fat or whatever. I mean, I think it's still a little early to be very prescriptive on that. But I do think we're getting there. And I think as more and more resources get dedicated to this, I think as more and more studies are done, most importantly, on how this actually translates to clinical practice, I think the more precision we will have. I think someday, probably not in the too distant future, we will be able to better do that. I just think it's still a little premature for a lot of these products to say you need to eat exactly this way, based on your genetic variants, without looking at labs and symptoms and that type of thing.
And we have, is it 30,000 genes, give or take, in our bodies?
Yeah, we have 30,000 genes, and then we have millions and millions of these SNPs I was talking about. So it's like, that's why if you do some of the studies that we have done, in a normal study, clinical trial, you need to have a P value of 0.05, not to get too deep in the statistics, but in these GWAS studies that our team has done, think about the opportunities for chance when you have millions of these SNPs, to be associated with some kind of outcome. You need to have that's a 10 to the negative eighth. So there's a lot. There's a lot of genes that are having roles in this, and there's a lot there. I mean, there's a huge amount of potential, but I do think we need to continue to better understand how all these things interact.
Do we know how many of these genes have been identified to this point to have a specific influence on our diet or weight or health? Is it like in the hundreds that we know about, or in the thousands?
Yeah, I would say it's probably in the hundreds that have some types of effect. I mean, those that are consistent, it's what you look for in a lot of these studies. You look for replication. You want to see it across different kinds of studies, across different populations, even because it can be a little bit different in different populations across the world. But yeah, I'd say it's probably in the hundreds. So something more, yeah.
So then when we look at, we've identified in the hundreds of genes that we have some level of comfort or, confidence that there's an effect of these hundreds of genes, yet there's 30,000 there. It's hard to say that we're going to get this really individually tailored prescriptive nutrition advice at this point.
Yeah, I'd say so at this point, especially. And then we start to look at what effect does it have? I mentioned MTHFR. I'll give you an example from some of our studies. I go from the lycopene example. We found a gene called SETD7, which had been associated with prostate cancer in previous studies, and with lycopene in our study, which so there seemed to be some biological association, right? So this gene might be underlying the association between lycopene and prostate cancer, but it had an effect of like 8 or 9% of the lycopene concentration. Now, so it wasn't like those that had variants in this gene had 100 times as much lycopene or 1/100th as much lycopene. We're talking it's somewhat modest effects. And for our study of alpha carotene, which is like the little brother of beta carotene, but still, actually quite important in a lot of the same orange, colored foods. Same thing. It was like a gene, PRKCE variant on that was like 6 or 7% influence on alpha carotene. So you got to look at a bunch of these things. You have a bunch of these together. Now, there was a gene called BCMO1 that had a bigger impact on carotenoids. We didn't see that in our studies, but these are not many of them are not having these huge impacts, but collectively together, they probably are. We just need, again, as time goes on, as more work goes into this, we're going to be able to be more prescriptive, but it's not quite there, I think, for a lot of these, but they may work. I mean, look, I think some people will get these and it may hit a few keys, and look, I think if the recommendations that are given, we could look at it this way too. If someone is eating a pretty poor diet and they come back and they get a quote unquote genetics informed diet that's pretty healthy, well, that's good. At least
it's a win got them, either way.
Yeah,
right.
It's a win either way. But how much of that is really due to the genes or not? It may be, but it may not be.
It was a couple of years back, and I won't say which of the DNA test kits, but a colleague of mine and I did the test kits together. And he's about the same age as me, and he is about twice my weight. And I'm about 120 something. He's about 250 something. And we each did our swabs. We sent in our kit. We get our results back, and we had the exact same prescriptive nutrition advice. Exactly. It was identical, like within, a 5% variance. And so we were like, that to me was laughable. And again, this is several years ago. There was even less known then. But I was like, you know what? We need to give this a few years for science to catch up and that one is still out on the market. Like that brand is still out on the market. It didn't fold. And so I was like, we still need some time here. And actually with the kits that I'm doing this time, my husband will do one, I'll do one. And then we're having a friend of ours who has a totally different body type, different ethnicity, do a third, so that we have 3 very different people. Because I'm very interested to see, just having had that experience that other time, and that was, an isolated event, but I'm just curious to see, how would it compare, especially for the kit that we're doing that does have a little bit more prescriptive nutrition advice. I'm curious to see how that'll measure out. But I agree that if the end result is that it is causing us to follow a diet and be motivated to incorporate these lifestyle changes that are better for us, then it's a win all around. And I think that's kind of what a lot of this is about is, okay, well, the science might not quite be there yet, but we want to find that extra edge. We want to find that, elusive magic bullet that's going to help us to maximize our wellness. And so as long as it's not doing harm, and in a lot of these cases, maybe the most harm is to someone's pocketbook, but if it can still point them in the right direction.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of, real world wisdom in that. I think that is true. And I do think we will get to the point where that we will have a little bit more under the hood. And some of these are, but I think given the example that you said, I mean, gosh, I sure hope they didn't tell you that you needed to have the same amount of caloric intake and so on.
It wasn't far off. Yeah, it was. It was. I don't want to say the word laughable because that sounds rude, but it was. It was like, wow. Right. Yeah. So when the kits that I'll be doing, and you and I are going to be talking about in the future, whenever I have all the results back, 23andMe, that is one. 23andMe, DNA Fit, VitaGene. They're very different. So 23andMe gives, and I wanted to kind of talk with you about these just to see, these give not really the prescriptive nutrition advice, but I'll be getting a report on a laundry list of different traits that I am more predisposed for. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So 23andMe, yeah, I think it's a what it is. It's a base. What I think, this is what I did too, is that, you get your 23andMe and you can upload those data. Of course, there's people that are concerned with the privacy of that into other, what are called sort of like filters, and interpretive tools. So that's it. I mean, 23andMe is good. I mean, in and of itself, I wouldn't frankly even bother too much with the health reports they give you, because I think you can get some better information from some of these other sort of filters and interpretive softwares that are out there. But that's a pretty common starting point. And then others will actually, maybe some of the other ones that you're doing, you'll actually do the swab, and then send it off to them, and they'll give you the variants and interpretations that way.
And on the staying on 23andMe for a minute, some of the things that they give, like I said, it's not prescriptive as in this many calories, carbs, protein, but it will give, for example, genetic likelihood for blood sugar issues or for high cholesterol. Like how, kind of going back to which of these types of reports do you have confidence in versus what you don't? How do you feel, what's the science behind these when we are looking at someone's, these more general, and also how we process caffeine, how we process alcohol, if we're fast or slow metabolizer, what's the science say on these?
Well, I think it depends on which one is the caffeine is actually a colleague of mine, Ahmed El-Sohaini. He's done a lot of good work with that. Actually, there is a variance on the CYP1A2 gene that's pretty well produced at this point, that people are either fast or slow metabolizers on that.
Can you explain to our listeners a little of what that means?
Sure. What basically means that those that be a slow metabolizer would really want to stop having their caffeine early in the day. If they have it at all, they're just not going to be able to get rid of it very quickly. And that, again, sometimes it'll map with the symptoms that people have, like those that tend to get really jittery with caffeine or just feel anxious or just don't feel very good, frankly, tend to be slow metabolizers of it. And they will often have these variants in the CYP1A2 gene. So
it's staying in your system longer, basically.
Exactly. Staying in your system longer, and thus having a stronger effect, usually, or a more tangible effect, I guess, if we were to break it down in simplistic terms. But it lasts a long. So I think those that are a slow metabolizer would want to, caffeine's, I think, fascinating. It's got some good data, does some really good things, or it can do some really bad things if you have it too late. It interferes with your sleep quality. I'm a big sleep person. I think it's still, I think more people are recognizing, but I think it's still underrated in terms of its impact. But so those that have some of the slow metabolizers, you want to stop having your caffeine at least 10 or 12 hours before you go to bed. Others, I know people that do this, that they can quantify their sleep. They've got their Oura Ring, and they have, I wouldn't recommend this, but where they can have caffeine later in the day, or they're probably faster metabolizers of it. So that the data on that are pretty good.
Okay.
So other ones like blood sugar, that's a little more complicated. I think there's a lot of things that go into that, but I think there's good science that's being done every day on this, where we start to have a little more sort of information upon which to build recommendations. But again, it goes back to that. I think for these bigger picture things, like for a micronutrient, that's a pretty limited number of things that go into that. But for some of these other things like blood sugar or weight, there's so many other factors that it's really tough to, they're so multifactorial.
And going to the fast versus slow metabolizer, what about alcohol? Because I've seen some reports that say this, if someone's a fast or slow metabolizer of alcohol. Do you look at that usually with confidence? Do you kind of dismiss it?
I don't know as much about that one. Mm-hmm. I don't know as much about the genes for alcohol metabolism. So I can't comment on that one as much as caffeine. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the caffeine one, I'm really interested to see. I've personally just organically dialed mine back without really making a huge conscious effort. And I feel really good about it. I have a feeling I'm a slow metabolizer of it, because I have now my 2 cups in the morning and I feel like I don't need any more in the afternoon, but that's after like 40 years of having caffeine for a lot. And what are some of the others that you would say in these reports that you're like, yeah, this is legitimate. Like these are well recognized, and this you could look at this with confidence? And then what are some that you would say, don't take that just with a grain of salt if you see it in your report?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I like to look at the clusters of different genes. So on the micronutrient side, if you look at variants on BCM01, make sure you're eating enough carotenoids. With VDR, make sure you're getting enough vitamin D. VDR is vitamin D receptor. There's some other things too. If you start to look at, I think what's fascinating is some of the emotional disorders and production of neurotransmitters.
Mm-hmm.
So things like, if you look at MAO-A and B, COMT, which is another one, some of the ones that are involved in dopamine, DDC, those are pretty interesting too. And that's where if you start to put this into some of these filters, they'll look at some of these types of things. Again, I MTHFR, certainly, the C677T, but some of the other ones, there's BHMT. I'm getting into a lot of technicalities here, but I guess the value of getting to listen to some of these, you can always play it back. looking at some of those are important. And then inflammation being at the heart of a lot of disease, things like TNF alpha, NF kappa B, some of the genes and transcription factors around that are important. Those are the ones I think that we can speak with some confidence. Some others too, like ApoE, and that has been shown with the risk of cognitive decline in certain people. That's another one too. You get that, and you're like, well, gosh, that's where I think you got to think about the epigenetics to see that and say, I'm not destined.
Right. It's scary.
Yeah, it's scary. There's these Fox genes too. I'll tell you this much. My parents are living, and my grandparents lived to an average of 96. And I don't have the Fox, like, quote unquote, longevity gene. You would think I would with that kind of, and they all live like pretty normal lifestyles. They weren't, health enthusiasts like I am, not to any great degree. So, I think you look at these things and you take them with a grain of salt. I mean, I think they can be informative. They can be, let me keep that in mind. And if you do have specific symptoms, you can, potentially use this as a motivation to explore more deeply. But those are some of the ones that come to mind.
I'm excited about us looking through mine. So we said I'm doing the 23andMe, and then I'll be uploading those to DNA Fit, which will have more wellness, health, diet information. Then I'm curious to run this one by you for VitaGene. That's the third. So I'll do 23andMe, DNA Fit, VitaGene, at least those three, maybe another that and we'll be doing another podcast episode where we'll be kind of talking through, because there will be a lot of questions I'm sure I have for you of these and kind of interpretation that I think will also be valuable for our listeners. And the VitaGene, I'm a little bit surprised, and I'm very eager to see what this looks like, that the report includes customized meal plans and the, tailored macronutrient percentages. So tailored of protein, carb, fat, sort of like, again, like we were saying, that seems, I'll be really interested to see for myself, for my husband, for this other friend who will be doing them. We're all pretty aware of what we eat, what kind of keeps us in balance with where we are. And neither of us need to really gain weight or lose weight. So it'll be interesting to see I think we'll be good candidates to kind of just test this out and see what does this prescription look like versus what we currently do. But what I'm also, I noted that they sell supplements, so they can talk to us about what we may or may not be predisposed for, and then they can sell us the supplements for it. So, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not accurate, but it just kind of is a flag for me.
I think it's a little. I'm actually not familiar with VitaGene. I'd be curious to see it too. I think to get down to meal planning, I think that will sound good to a not someone like you that's very much in nutrition, but I think someone who really needs help. It's, oh, wow, they're actually going to get me down to the level of meal planning. We know that that's something that patients like. But I think the fact of the matter is, I think it may be saying, well, this is a good business model if we offer this. Some of the others aren't doing that. That to me seems mighty granular for what we have available now with actual meal planning. But, I'm happy to take a look and see. I'm actually, I've been familiarized. I haven't come across that one yet, but I'll look forward to taking a look at your results.
Yeah. And I did just kind of a search of what some of the ones were that were getting, lots of Google hits or seemed to have a lot of interest. So I kind of went with some of those. I guess, more popular, like at least people are buying or searching it, or even if they're not buying it a lot, they're getting advertised to a lot by these companies.
Sure.
So I think, is there anything else for us to kind of keep in mind or think about? Because between now and when I get my reports back, I know some of our listeners may do some of their own DNA test kits. Is there anything that you would say we haven't covered that we should, or anything just kind of to leave us on to close it out?
No, I think you hit, and this is really great. I mean, I think this is a great big picture view, and I'm getting into some specifics too of this topic. I do think this is the future, and I think part of it is the present. And I just look forward to the continuing evolution of these tests and, more people trying them out. I mean, there's that data too. There's real world data that we're going to be getting back and from users and so on. So I look forward to, hearing the results of yours and going through the results of yours and any of your listeners and what they might come up with. So I think you hit the big topics today, with the nutrigenics, the nutrigenomics, and some of the key findings in those areas and what it means in the big context, that this is predisposition, not predeterminations, and not to freak out, maybe just a little more impetus to continue or start the healthy lifestyle practices. And
as we said earlier too, our genes are not our destiny, and be using this though as one tool, as one more piece of education. And then the things that we know are the core pillars of wellness, nutrition, movement or exercise, sleep that we've talked about, and then also how we manage stress. Those 4 things are so key for our health, for our weight, for everything. And using these genetic reports, if we can use these to help motivate us to follow through as best we can on those other areas of our lifestyle, even better.
Right on. Yeah. No matter what our genes say, those 4 pillars are key for all of us.
Well, sweet. Well, I can't wait to have these reports. I think what we'll probably do is have I'll share with you, and we can kind of have some huddle calls. We'll get ourselves together, and then we can share with our listeners what some of the interesting results are we have too.
All right. Sounds like a great plan. Look forward to doing so.
Awesome. Thanks for your time.
Okay. You got it. Take care.
I'm so honored, so grateful to Dr. D'Adamo for joining us today. There's so much to wrap our heads around. It's just so much information to digest, to learn, and sift through and see how this really applies to us. As I mentioned earlier, this is a 2-part podcast series. In next week's episode, Dr. D'Adamo is back. He is going to be walking me through my personal results and helping us to look and see what is relevant, what's truly based on science and my genes, and what's based on pooled data that's really not quite as impactful, not quite as significant, but it can be hard to tell when you're looking at your results, what's what. It's really easy it's basically all lumped together. So he's going to really help us sort through that and see, when we have all this data, how do we dig through it and see what's really relevant, what's really impactful for us. As always, I'll include the links that we've talked about in the show notes of this episode. And if you try any of the DNA diets, DNA testing kits, please let me know. I always want to hear about it. I am registered dietitian Molly Kimball, and you've been listening to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, the podcast. If you would like more Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, please head over to mollykimball.com, and you can follow me, Molly Kimball RD, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you haven't yet, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join us next week for another dose of Fueled Wellness and Nutrition. Thanks for listening, and stay focused on living your strongest, healthiest life.